Well, first up on the show, fresh developments, and European powers have triggered a dispute mechanism over the nuclear deal with Iran. This after the country took a further step back from its commitments. It's seen as the first step towards reimposing further United Nations sanctions on Iran. Triggering the dispute resolution mechanism will set the clock running on what could be some 60 days of negotiation with Iran about coming back into full compliance with the deal. If Iran fails to do so, it could end up with a slapback of United States nations sanctions on Iran, which may also include an arms embargo. Expressing concerns over the current crisis between Iran and the US, the three countries have said that they are not joining a campaign to implement maximum pressure against Iran. Iran had suspended its limits on production of enriched uranium, which can be used for nuclear weapons earlier. Under the nuclear deal, Iran agreed to limit its sensitive activities and allow inspectors to return for the lifting of economic sanctions. Donald Trump reinstated that he would force Iran to negotiate a new agreement that would place indefinite curbs on its nuclear program. The move would also have halted its development of ballistic missiles, but Iran has refused.
A nuclear weapon.
So, of course, European Union powers, the three major nations there, the UK, France and Germany, are now set to impose fresh sanctions under the UN sanction list against Iran for not upholding its commitments under the Iran nuclear deal that was signed in 2015. This comes in the backdrop of the escalating tensions between the United States and Iran. And, of course, remember, the US has already slapped several sanctions and trade impositions on Iran. 17 fresh sanctions just last week by the Trump administration. So a lot of pressure on Iran now to come back to the negotiating table. Whether it would do so or not, only time will tell. Of course, this has been something that has been in the spotlight for over 10 days now. Meanwhile, mass protests in Iran have entered their third day despite apologies from the top leadership. Public anger is building over the downing of a Ukrainian aircraft. On Monday, the protesters squarely targeted the powerful clergy in Iran at universities in Tehran and in Isfahan. Students shouted, "Clerics get lost," even as riot police took positions ready to charge at them. And thousands of protesters took to the streets in the Iranian capital of Tehran, calling for justice after their government admitted to having shot down a Ukrainian airliner. Student protesters chanted slogans against the leaders, calling them liars for initially denying that Iran had downed the plane. Protesters also called for the resignation of the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The protesters have found support from the US President Donald Trump, who reiterated his warning to the Iranian government. Trump also said that he wasn't concerned about negotiating with Iran, but that his focus was on ensuring that no protesters were killed during the demonstrations in Iran. So Iran, of course, is now seeing large-scale protests against its own leaders, including the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and that, of course, is a big trouble for Iran and its clergy as well. And well, joining us now to talk a little bit more about the fresh sanctions likely to be imposed on Iran under the UN sanctions list is my colleague Lucy Hoff, joining us from Brussels. And Lucy, going back to that point of the European Union considering now a dispute mechanism against Iran, what does this entail? What does this mean?
Well, this is a process that's within the terms of the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear accord. It's essentially a last resort. We have seen concerted diplomatic efforts from key EU countries in the last few days since, of course, the killing of the top Iranian General Soleimani. They have been desperately trying to reach out to Iran and Washington to try and persuade both sides to come come back to the terms of the Iran nuclear deal. Washington, of course, withdrew unilaterally from the arrangement in 2018. Tehran then voted a few days later to abandon the last limits imposed on its nuclear proliferations. But now this message from the E3, UK, France and Germany, they've said that they are concerned about that Iran's actions are inconsistent with the provisions of the nuclear agreement. They have increasingly severe and non-reversible proliferation implications, and they are now triggering this dispute resolution process. So it is very much a last chance saloon for the Iran nuclear deal, but certainly the E3 are keen to get Iran back around the table for this to trigger discussion, but it does seem to mark the end of that 2015 nuclear accord.
But they're also, of course, going at length to say that this is not part of the maximum pressure initiative started by the United States, that they still want Iran back on the negotiating table, but pushed to the corner. Do you really think that Iran at this point is going to agree to any terms?
I think it's highly unlikely, but of course, yes, the E3 they say that they don't want to impose new sanctions, that this is a means to get Iran back round the table, that it's hoping to continue to be able to use discussion and diplomacy to try and salvage what remains of this deal. But really, it does mark really the last moments, I think, of this deal. We know, of course, that Washington is very much on its own path. It has imposed new sanctions last week. Trump has spoken, of course, of this maximum pressure. The E3 have taken a different approach. We knew last week that they were trying to issue an invitation to the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif to Brussels to try and get him to engage in further talks, that they withheld from going ahead with this dispute resolution process for fear of further alienating Tehran, when, of course, tensions were high, particularly between Washington and Tehran. So they have withheld on this action, but it is action that's now going ahead this week. If it goes ahead, it could lead to renewed UN sanctions imposed on Iran.
Right, absolutely. Lucy Huff, thanks very much indeed for joining us with the latest coming out from the European Union, Big Three, UK, France and Germany, saying that there will be a dispute mechanism that will be started against Iran.